We're excited to be joined by two of our partners today, folks from Malwarebytes and Twingate. And this presentation is going to round out our programming this week for Coalition's first Security Week. And this week we've been really enjoying having some in-depth discussions with a number of our technology partners to talk about different discussions that are happening across cybersecurity. And for all of you brokers who we partner with, policyholders who we insure, and others who are just interested in learning more about this space, you know that this is a very dynamic and fast-changing marketplace with a new headline popping up every day about a new cybersecurity incident or data breach. And so we're really excited to be joined by these partners to talk a little bit more in depth about what's happening in the marketplace, what we're seeing, and what solutions we can offer to help you protect your organization from being a victim of a cyber attack. So today, I'm excited to go into defense in depth. We're going to be talking about zero trust networks and EDR with Twingate and Malwarebytes. And we're really going to be talking about how your organization can take a layered approach to cybersecurity solutions to best protect yourselves and best protect your entire perimeter of your organization from being discoverable and being impacted by cybercrime. And I'm excited to be joined by a few folks, but before I introduce them, I'm gonna just first point your attention to the bottom of your screen. We're using Zoom for this webinar, and you should see two icons where you can submit questions, the chat icon or the Q&A. We're going to reserve time at the end to have audience questions, but we're also going to be sort of doing some panel style discussions throughout. And so please keep sending your questions in, and we'll be excited to get to those at the end of the discussion. All right, so thank you to three panelists for joining us today. So first, Adam Kujawa, who's the director of Malwarebytes Labs and a security evangelist. So thank you, Adam, for joining us. Next, Alex Marshall, who's the Chief Product Officer and co-founder of Twingate. And then lastly, Tommy Johnson, who is on the threat intelligence team here at Coalition. My name is Jen, and I'll be moderating the discussion today. And before we kick off, I'm going to have each of these guys give a little bit more of an introduction to what their company does and then what their role is. And then we're going to kick it off. All right, Adam, let's start with you.
Yeah, sure thing. Hello, folks. My name's Adam Kujawa. I am one of the directors of Malwarebytes Labs at Malwarebytes, and a lot of my responsibility involves doing stuff like this, trying to educate folks. But what Malwarebytes is primarily is a provider of endpoint solutions. We've got enterprise and small business solutions for a lot of our customers who are mainly focused on small business, where we provide endpoint security with anti-ransomware technology, anti-exploit technology, remote management capabilities to quickly isolate systems and things like that. And if you don't know that we do have enterprise stuff, you'll probably recognize us from all of our consumer products that we've been pushing for about 10 years, so over 10 years now.
Great, thanks for joining us. Alex, over to you.
Great, yeah, thanks for having us on this. I'm excited to look forward to the discussion. So yeah, I'm one of the co-founders of Twingate. If you haven't heard of Twingate, we are a zero trust network access product. And so I think sort of like break that down a little bit, since it's a bit of a mouthful. You think about us as like a vastly more secure VPN to allow your employees to get access to internal resources. So a lot of my work with co-founders on the product side is really figuring out how do we make using our product as easy as possible, and how do we integrate into companies' existing systems. But really, like Twingate's sort of like longer term mission is to create a secure internet for work, and hopefully we'll be able to cover a lot of those different concepts going as part of the discussion. So nice to meet everybody.
Thank you. And Tommy, last but not least.
Yep. So my name's Tommy Johnson. I work here at Coalition, the host of this webinar. Basically, what I do here is sort of threat intelligence between claims and underwriting. So what I do is, as new attacks come out, we very quickly look at our whole book. We see, okay, who's affected by this? How should we adjust the underwriting guidelines? What can we do to keep everyone safe? So basically, like what I'm doing is looking at threat intelligence data and adapting that to underwriting here for the benefit of our insureds.
Great. Well, thank you all. Very privileged to get to have you share some of your expertise in this discussion today. So thank you. And just a reminder to everyone to submit questions throughout the presentation. All right, so we're going to start off with a question, sort of setting the stage, so we all are kind of using the same language about, what risks we're actually talking about. I'd love for you to start, Alex, talking about when we talk about the digital perimeter of an organization. What does that actually mean? What is the sort of digital footprint of a company, and how should they think about understanding what assets might be exposed to the internet?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think this has become like a much more complex question. So in a lot of the conversations that we're having with our customers is that this old model, which is commonly referred to as this sort of castle and moat model, where you used to have, headquarters office, computers were in the office, people showed up at the office, they did their work. It was pretty straightforward to secure that. It was obviously still wasn't easy, but at least it was more straightforward to understand that data, people, and devices were all in the same physical place. And I think as sort of like the pandemic has shown us all acutely over the last 12 to 18 months, that just doesn't apply anymore. And that sort of trend was like happening anyway before the pandemic started. And so what the reality is today is that people are everywhere. They're on different networks. They have different devices. There's some combination of using, let's say, like a personal cell phone and a work laptop to access work information. That work information isn't in one place anymore either. So it can be, perhaps some of that can be back at the office or whatever is left of the office these days, or it could be on a public cloud like AWS or Azure. And so answering that question, like what the perimeter is, has become a lot harder. So a lot of the sort of like conversations that we have with our customers are really like them trying to get their arms around like, how do we actually define what that new sort of perimeter looks like, and then how do we secure access to it? So I think a lot of like what this sort of, I mentioned this sort of zero trust concept earlier, a lot of what the zero trust concept involves is thinking about a person using a particular device needs to gain access to a particular resource or application internally. And it's thinking about that every time that happens, there needs to be a decision made about whether that person, that device should be allowed to access that resource. And so what's happening in the moment is you're really trying to figure out what is the perimeter and the rules that should actually apply to that one request. So what we've really gone from is this model of this castle and moat model where everything is in the same place to now a new model where every time someone tries to access something, that is considered, a perimeter request. Like, should someone be RDPing into a network? Should someone be using gaining access to some kind of like web dashboard or some other internal application? So every single request is now its own perimeter with its own rules. So that's why I think it's a lot more complicated now, but that is the reality I think that people are trying to get their arms around.
Got it. And Adam, what would you add to that?
Oh, I agree with everything Alex said. We don't have the castle and moat approach anymore. It's not as easy anymore. And unfortunately, when you have, greater accessibility, security hurts. Or if you have greater security, accessibility hurts. And so even what Alex is talking about will require additional technology and authentication methods in order to make it easy for people to give that authentication every single time. But I think something else we have to think about is third-party vendors, folks that have access through APIs, folks that possibly have relationships or some sort of access into our internal networks from outside of the network that we work with. Let's say we have a vendor that we provide them an API with, and let's say that vendor gets compromised, and then they use that API to attack us somehow. So that's the kind of thing we need to think of, that not even just where our secure data is located, but where are additional entry points into the network or into our organization, or additional accesses that don't need to be had, or things like that. We have to lock down exactly who has access to what, and make sure that we monitor those entry points as securely as possible. So like Alex said, the perimeter is hard to define anymore, and it's certainly reach out beyond the walls of an office. And I think we've got a long way to go to fully understand both how to secure that data and how to at least account for it too.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, please.
Go ahead. Yeah, I can just add something. I think there's sort of like a couple of concepts too. It's like, what does that external perimeter look like, which I think is sort of where we're talking about. But yeah, Adam, you bring up a great point. I think there's sort of like internal perimeters too, which is that whether that's, it's a great example, like between vendors, vendor systems, internal systems, but even internally, what are the boundaries between internal systems and how have they been defined? And I think all of this is really sort of being reconsidered right now, and needs to, I think, just needs a lot more attention than I think it was given in the past.
Yeah, I would also just say on Adam's point, another way we can think about this with vendors is, in the news last week, Kaseya. So, you can say, oh, I trust my MSP. They use this tool. Like if my MSP comes into my network, that's a good thing. We trust them. A lot of people don't really think about this, but if you grant someone access to your perimeter, their perimeter becomes your perimeter in a way. So it's not just the castle and moat like we talked about. It's you're giving people bridges over that moat. So the security of your vendors is also very important.
So continuing in that vein, Tommy, I'm curious if you could answer how you, on the technical underwriting side, think about an organization's perimeter when it comes to assessing their risk from an insurance perspective or an insurability perspective. What are you looking for when you're evaluating how risky a company is and what their exposure is?
Yeah, so what we're basically trying to do is look at that attack surface. The way we underwrite at Coalition is similar to the way that adversaries look at targets, right? So basically, we're trying to figure out what's on the network, what's exposed to the public internet, where does the PII live, what kind of PII do they have, and an analogy that we use here a lot is the house. We're looking at the house, if that's your network, and does that house have open doors or open windows? So we're looking at like on-premises servers that are exposed, stuff like that. So we want to look at the technical attack surface, game it out as an adversary. If there's a lot of stuff on-prem that is being exposed directly to the internet, that may not be a great risk. If there's an end-of-life server exposed to the internet, that may not be a great risk. It may make them uninsurable. So basically the way we're looking at it is, what can we see to game out how we would attack this as an adversary? And this may segue into Alex's product, but one good signal that we look for is obfuscation of that perimeter. So basically like a software defined networking, the way it works is, if you're on the street and you're looking at this house, you can see like the open doors and windows, right? The way things are going with perimeters and software defined perimeters, if you put something in front of the perimeter like Twingate or any other SDN product, it would be as if there's a wall around the house and there's only one door. So as far as like the way we underwrite, basically the less we can see on the attack surface, the better. However, we'll also say that, we are taking an outside-in approach, and as we underwrite, we can't see what's inside the house if you use the house analogy. So we're making our best educated guess based on what's exposed on the attack surface to say, oh, we think this is this risky, in addition to some responses on like a ransomware supplemental.
So, continuing in that vein, what can an organization do to reduce their likelihood of being targeted? You kind of started to answer that, Tommy, but Alex, I'm curious if there's anything you'd add to that in terms of what an organization can do to lower that likelihood of being, observed and intruded.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think the house analogy is great, and I think what perhaps like people don't or maybe underappreciate is just how easy it is to basically scan every single IP address on the internet. There's all kinds of there's actually an open tool. If anyone's curious, go to Shodan. I think it's shodan.com or .net or .org. Shodan.io. There you go. Yes, one of those top level domains. So Shodan, and it publicly available information there. And if you actually just search for example, VPN, which most companies would consider a secure entry point as their network, you can actually just get a list of every single open VPN server. And so it's actually very easy to do this, and attackers are pretty sophisticated about this. And every time that there's some kind of vulnerability with, to use Tommy's example, one of those doors, which should be locked, but as we all know, locks can be picked in the same way, software can be compromised. People take advantage of that. So I think going back to your sort of question, Jen, how to reduce the risk of being targeted. I think the most sort of the lowest hanging fruit is really making sure that there are no public entry points. And this isn't sort of a Twingate presentation, but I do think like one of the very, very sort of like common conversations we have is that what we'd actually go one step further, I think, than Tommy's analogy, is that the analogy of using a product like, Twingate with our type of technology is there's a wall around the house and there doesn't appear to be any door at all, right? So a lot of what we talk to our customers about is you can make your outside perimeter invisible to the outside world. And so I think that's like a really great starting point. But I think it also, beyond using, zero trust type product, I think it's also like having like internal discipline around making sure that you sort of approach, sort of looking at your external perimeter in the same way that an attacker would. So are you actually checking to make sure that nothing's available? What processes do you have set up internally to make sure that, employees or whether unintentionally or otherwise are not opening up those entry points. So I think there's this, like the best place to start on all this is like make sure that external perimeter to the outside world is invisible, and you're far ahead of most people right now.
If you can do that.
Say more.
Well, I was going to say that I agree with everything that they said. You absolutely have to watch out for that perimeter. Oftentimes bad guys, they don't, target an organization because they know that organization. They target it because it's an opportunity, because there's an insecure port, because there's a exploit, that's available to launch, because there's some sort of, insecurity. Or in some cases, like with what we see usually from phishing attacks, someone inside the network has fallen for a phish or has, allowed an attacker to bypass a lot of the security and get in. So yeah, a big part of that is just trying to reduce how easy it looks to get in. If you give them that little opportunity, if you show them just a little bit of, we might be vulnerable here. Oh, maybe our RDP isn't, secured. Oh, maybe we don't use, multi-factor authentication, something like that. And that might be enough to get, a criminal group to focus on your organization. But, they are about the return on investment here. And if your organization is, as invisible as what Alex said and what, Tommy said, then there's a very low chance that you're going to be attacked from an external source. But you still have that internal stuff to worry about, and you have to, provide training. You have to provide opportunities, you have to provide resources to your employees on how to report phishing attacks, on how to quickly, respond to possible attempts at breaching networks through the human, and allowing them that kind of empowering them creates an additional layer of reduced targeting.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I would say that the human is part of the attack surface, right? And like, if your network is fully invisible from like, a technical targeting perspective, you still have email, right? So that's something else to definitely consider. I was just going to say one more thing on this, how can we reduce the visibility in the targeting with an example from yesterday, actually. So there is an ongoing ransomware campaign that attacks end-of-life sonic wall devices, right? So if you have an end-of-life sonic wall device, PSA, you definitely want to take it offline because it can't be updated and fixed. But the way that the adversaries attack these kind of things is they scan the internet for sonic walls, and they just start like blasting this exploit, right? So if you obfuscate your perimeter with a technology or something like that to where they actually can't see that sonic wall, you're not going to make the targeting list. So they're not even going to bother, like the adversaries aren't going to like attack the whole internet, every single server. They're going to try and reduce their targeting set down to things that are vulnerable as best they can. And actually Coalition does the same thing when we notify. So we're not exploiting. So let me be very clear, but we actually, so, when the sonic wall ransomware campaign started, based on claims data and based on threat intelligence, we said, okay, so is there any way we can determine the version number of the sonic walls? Which insureds on our books have sonic walls like that are this end of life? And if we scan our book, how can we get in contact? Like, do we need to escalate with a phone call? So we're scanning the book the same way that the adversaries are targeting for the ransomware. And like in a lot of these cases, like it's a race between us and them to see, can we tell you to fix this before it turns into ransomware? Or not. So yeah, it's pretty interesting, the attack surface question and how it relates to target sets, and security through obscurity sometimes does work because they're not able to see your vulnerable technology.
Oh yeah, if you just blend in with with the rest of the world, you're not going to stand out.
Yeah, I will say, I mean, it's sort of, I was gonna say,
Go
like,
ahead.
we sort of talking about the perimeter a lot, but I think just to like actually say a little more about what Adam was saying earlier, given that this is about like defense in depth, that is just like one part of it. And I think just like sort of double click on what Adam was saying, that the other side of this is, let's say you target someone internally who you expect to have like privileges to be able to move around inside the network, like that's obviously a very common attack vector. And I think we're gonna talk more about that, but there's other terms for like the blast radius, right? So if somebody gets compromised or a device gets compromised, like how do you reduce the number of systems that they have access to? And I think that's sort of like the corollary to like, okay, make the perimeter invisible, but then once, if you assume that someone has been compromised internally, that's sort of like the zero trust concept. Make sure that they have as little access as necessary. So I think that's a huge part of it as well.
Let's dive into that a little bit more in terms of, you all sort of touched upon different vulnerabilities and access points that can result in an organization being compromised. But I'd love for you to sort of address specifically, how do you actually see, whether it's just customers or just companies that you've worked with, how do you actually see their networks getting breached? Whether you have any specific examples you want to share. And Adam, I'd love if you could kick us off with that question, and then we'll go over to you.
Yeah, sure thing. Well, I mean, for the majority of most cybercrime that we've seen, it's honestly, it's a lot of it's through phishing. A whole lot of it is through phishing. It's been the primary method of spreading malware since the 1980s almost. And it works, and it has always worked, and it may never stop working. But over the last couple of years, especially when the pandemic, people were working from home, everything got really shifted up, and so we saw lots more folks or attackers going after like insecure RDP ports. And we've actually added new functionality to target how much brute forcing and cracking is going on and trying to breach networks manually, instead of kind of the more automated approach of sending out a phish, waiting for the malware to get installed, and then letting you in the back door. So we're seeing a whole lot of that. We're seeing a lot of really interesting, sophisticated methods of attack, where you have an initial breach, but then they do something like install the Cobalt Strike platform on some server inside your own network, and then use that to identify vulnerabilities in other systems to move laterally, or to open up new opportunities. We're talking about external organizations, external vendors being potentially vulnerable and being a method of breaching your own network. So that's basically a supply chain attack right there. And we're seeing an increase in those as well. So while we have definitely seen kind of a reduction, I think, in targeting overall, the sophistication behind what is being done is incredibly impressive and alarming as well. There's a lot of what we're seeing now is less about bringing in malware tools and more about utilizing tools that we have in the system, living off the land tools, using applications designed to administer networks, and instead being used to infect them and spread malware and stuff like that. So that's what we're seeing, at least from the Malwarebytes point of view.
Yeah, I would also say I have an interesting claims parallel with the. I know we talked about Kaseya earlier. We see, like, with the Kaseya attack, first of all, it's all automated, right? So like they exploited this Kaseya, they sent the ransomware down the line, and they actually like hard coded into the ransomware is a script that disables the backups. So like they are getting very sophisticated. They're getting very good at what they're doing. Adversaries are also getting really fast at scanning RDP. I'm going to touch on another point that Adam just said. Phishing always applies. So I know I'm kind of like the underwriting voice on this call. This is the reason that cyber insurance will always be around. Basically, when technical attacks fail, phishing succeeds. My experience is in pen testing before I came to Coalition. It was unfortunate when we would get a pen test and we wouldn't be able to hack the company with only technical means, but we could always fall back on phishing, and it always worked. A good example of that is we talk about word macros as an attack vector, right? So say I'm a bad guy and I want to spread ransomware, and I'm going to take the lowest possible sophistication attack for the biggest payoff. One of those is sending like a malicious PDF to HR, like apply for a job. It is their job to open your document and examine your resume. So definitely, like, phishing always applies, and as we underwrite with that in mind, right? Like there's no easy solution to that. The best solution is defense in depth.
Yeah, just to add on to that, there was a family of malware, very, very popular. I'm sure you all have heard of it, Emotet. They've gone down since because the law enforcement has jumped in, but their efforts and lessons and technology developments that they've done over the years have really changed the game, in the sense that they actually they knew how effective phishing was, based on the fact that they included a spam module inside of the Emotet malware. So the system would get infected through probably a macro, a malicious macro script attached to a Word document or something. And then once that happened, the Emotet binary would take the contact list of the user, or even search for existing threads. So like if, the 3 of us or 4 of us here had an email thread going on, and then someone breached my system, and then suddenly I sent a message in the same thread to everybody in the thread saying, oh, hey, can you guys double check this document or whatever? You click on it, you open it, you think it's from me, you trust me, and then suddenly you're infected. The process starts over again. So it's terrifying.
And just to put a number to that, we last year published a report that sort of details all of our claims data, claims and incident response, and we're about to come out with our next one soon. And the stat that really strikes me from this conversation is that 50%, I think the number is 47%, so almost 50% of all of our claims in the past year, the first entry point was phishing. So just to underscore the fact that, you can have really, and you should have all of those sort of layered defenses in place, and humans become your last line of defense, and the human firewall, if you will, becomes really critical.
Yeah, and I think similarly, I think some of these like phishing attacks are like incredibly sophisticated, and I think it should give everyone pause about how they actually sort of evaluate that risk. I think it's much greater, I think, than people think. So it's good to hear some of these stats from you guys. What I want to do is actually just link that a little bit back to like how you organize your networks internally a little bit, because if we assume that there's a high chance that it's possible to phish someone in your organization, then I think what you need to think about is like, well, what do you do? So what? So then what? Okay, so you want to make sure you prevent that. But of course, then part of that is like, what do people actually have access to internally? And I just want to cover like one example of, I think, where some thinking needs to change a little bit in terms of internal network architecture. And one of those is, this is a pretty common example where an office network, let's say, has been given whitelist IP access to some kind of public cloud network. And it's convenient because from the company standpoint, it's like, okay, like if you're an employee, you have a work device, we only let work devices connect to the company Wi-Fi. And if you're on the company network, you can access our AWS, cloud infrastructure. And the problem with that is that now you have like this wide open surface area that allows someone to move laterally from your corporate network to, let's say, your production AWS network. And so a lot of what we've been trying to like educate our customers on is, I think to Tommy's point, it's absolutely possible, like from a technical standpoint, to actually like really make it very difficult to move around on physical networks. And so we've been trying to educate people on is that you had to, sort of by necessity, modify your network configuration in order to make access easy. You don't have to do that anymore. And so a lot of what we encourage our customers to do is think about individual network segments. You should segment them from each other based on your security requirements, and then use a zero trust type product to give very limited access into the network segments on an as needed basis. So you never want to link these all together. And I think that's just one example where if you can rethink how you're configuring your physical networks, you can actually reduce the risk posed by any person in your organization getting phished, and then sort of focus your defense on the people that are really critical in your company. So you're sort of like, let's take all those defense resources and let's put them on the people that actually have the most internal access. So I think it's sort of like how the thinking changed a little bit.
Yeah, I can actually comment on that. One of the great things about my job that I think is really cool is like, it is really unfortunate, when an insured does have a claim, but I get to see like the whole picture from like underwriting to managing the risk during the policy period to the claim, right? And a good illustration of what you just described is some of our worst claims ever have been totally flat networks, right? So I'm getting into the technical weeds just a little bit here, but it was one flat network under like one Active Directory domain. When you have a situation like that where there is no segmentation between satellite offices or anything, if the administrator computer, the domain controller gets compromised, the adversary can push ransomware to everything. So one of our worst claims ever, this happened. It was a totally flat domain with no segmentation whatsoever. And they had like food mixers, like industrial mixers. They couldn't access those. Like everything got ransomed. And the compensating control for that is good segmentation, right? That way, the damage can be limited. Say your backups are segmented off from the rest of the network, you should be able to restore from the backups because they don't get encrypted. So yeah, just the way the network is built and is segmented off is critically important.
So continuing in that vein, I'd love to hear, Alex and Adam, if you have any horror stories that you've seen firsthand in terms of some of the most interesting breaches that you've had the pleasure to deal with in your careers.
Maybe Adam, you should go first because I can't speak from firsthand experience, but I do have a really interesting story that people may not be aware of. So go ahead.
I mean, we see crazy stuff all the time. When it comes to the types of attacks that are out there, I've seen ransomware attacks that put child pornography on the lock screen and then say, go ahead and call the cops and see what happens. What we're seeing recently with this particular campaign called Bazaar Call is really, really fascinating. And I've never seen this before. And this is something that's only been happening over the last few weeks. But basically what happens is that a user gets a phishing email. That email says, hey, you're about to pay a subscription fee for something that you don't actually own. Call us to make sure it doesn't happen. We see this kind of stuff all the time with Malwarebytes scammers, people that send people invoices, assuming to be from us about, oh, we're going to renew your service, but you better call us, if you don't want to pay $500. Anyway, so they, excuse me, they leave a phone number and the user calls the phone number and there's a person on the other side. There's actually like a call center being like, hey, let me help you out with that. To unsubscribe, you go to this website, they plug in a subscription number, and then it offers them a download. And they're like, go ahead and download this thing. It's going to help you or whatever. And you open up that download and it's an Excel spreadsheet with a malicious macro in it and installs the Bazaar Loader malware, which is basically like a different version of Emotet. And from there, it can spread across your entire network, or it can just stay on a single endpoint. It honestly depends on the breach of the network or on the network itself. But this is just like insane amount of social engineering going into this kind of attack, and I've never seen something like that before.
Yeah, so similarly, I just like it's really astounding. I think when you read some of these stories. So again, it's just something I read about. Obviously, it's in a personal interaction here, but apparently, 3 years ago, there was a Chilean ATM network that was targeted, and you can sort of see where this is going. But what happened is that they basically spearphished a programmer, and then they actually this is all apparently North Korea finance. So they actually paid a criminal organization in the Caribbean somewhere to pose and actually pretend that they were someone that actually exists. So it wasn't just a made up person. It's like they posed as someone that actually exists, stole the person's identity, essentially, interviewed this person, 3 separate rounds of interviews, and went to all this trouble so that ultimately, and I'm actually not sure why the target did this, but they sent him some software to turn his resume into a PDF. Again, I don't know why he would do this, but he went through with it. That, of course, that was like the entry point. That installed whatever the malware was, that then moved on to their Active Directory system. And from there, as we talked about earlier, once you're on AD, you can provide all kinds of resources. And so the target was actually a mainframe that they were running. And the ultimate goal, like they actually thwarted this just almost by luck, I think, in time. But the goal was actually to then basically interfere with the ATM system so that a different criminal organization could go to each individual ATM and withdraw money in cash, basically. So super, super sophisticated. And when you think about, being targeted for interviews, I mean, it's just like, if someone's actually interviewing you, I mean, what are the limits here? So it's, some pretty stunning sophistication out there.
There's actually one more I wanted to say that reminded me of what you were talking about. This was like 5 or 6 years ago, back when exploits and exploit kits were really, really common. And all it took sometimes was just to visit a website that had the code, malicious code or exploit code built into it, or added to it, that would infect your system, and you get ransomware, all kinds of other stuff. So this, like I said, this was a few years ago. There was a forum for Apple developers, like iOS developers, and it's a very popular one where they hung out at a lot. And so what happened? This is called a watering hole technique. What happened is that attackers broke into the server hosting this forum, and then put some exploit code in there, specifically looking for users from specific areas or specific types of operating systems they were using. They were looking for iOS developers. They were looking to get access to codes behind things. And so when they did encounter someone that matched all the right, requirements of, hey, this is who we want to attack. And like I said, this is a popular forum, so lots of people would probably be accessing it from work while they're writing code or doing other things. And then an exploit would launch, and it would infect the system. And then suddenly, they were compromised, and the attackers had access to potentially iOS backend code. That was insane, and also a great example of how you can't really expect the bad guys to come through the front door every time. And even a phishing attack would have been a little more obvious in this particular case, but by doing something, by tricking the human into expecting where they're going and then attacking that point, I mean, who can expect that kind of thing to happen? So it's just more cases for how creative these guys can be.
Yeah, I have another good example of a watering hole attack similar to that. Well, it's a watering hole attack, but essentially years ago, there was a very popular lunch spot across the street from Pentagon where everyone went, right? And they did a lot of deliveries and stuff. So this was an APT, I believe it was Russian, but they compromised, the sub shop or whatever it was, its website, and they made the PDF for the menu serve malware. So that's like a really smart way of targeting, where essentially like an organization that is, like is an aggregation point for individuals at Pentagon. Basically, like they're going to be going there, they're going to be looking at the menu, they're going to be ordering takeout. Attacking that may get you into, someone's personal device or something like that at Pentagon. So definitely, like when we talk about attack surface, which I guess is like the theme of this discussion, like your humans are absolutely part of the attack surface, and their personal devices can be as well.
That's a literal watering hole example.
What I love about all of those examples is they highlight the fact that criminal hackers are extremely creative. And at the end of the day, as much as we like to talk about cybersecurity risk as being, our sort of digital attack surface and digital cyber risks, I mean, clearly they're exploiting human behavior and patterns of human behavior. And at the end of the day, to echo what you just said, Tommy, it really is about how well equipped are all the humans that make up the ultimate perimeter. How well equipped are they and your technologies to help stop one of these attacks? So I think we're going to turn over to audience questions from there. We've got a bunch of questions that have come in. So thank you for submitting those, and please feel free to continue to do so. So first, this is a question that I'm going to kick over to you, Tommy, which is, we talked a lot about the ways in which we can assess a company's attack surface and all the different entry points between their network, their employees, their vendors, et cetera. How does all of this impact, one, the claims that we see across our policyholders, and two, insurability, and sort of what some of the key things are that we look for in order to deem whether a company is eligible for insurance?
Yeah, sure. So it's important to note that we have, I guess, two methods of collection while we're underwriting. One is the technical scans that we already talked about, which is basically we're looking for your attack surface. We're looking for what technologies you have. Is it Office 365? Is it G Suite? What kind of VPNs you have. So that's number one, where we look at basically, okay, here are the internet-facing technologies. And if there's a technology that has recently been vulnerable, what we may say, hey, we'll offer you coverage if you fix this. In some cases, we may say, you need to do like an internal assessment or get a third party to do an assessment if this is a technology that we know has been exploited. So there may be a case where, you had Exchange, right? And Exchange was, the whole world was hacked that had an on-prem Exchange server. So we would say, hey, do an internal investigation, look for these indicators, run this script that says, you're not compromised, and then send that back to us and we can offer insurance. So that's kind of like an example of what Coalition does differently than other carriers. Is, we know the attack surface, we know the methods of exploitation, and we know the countermeasures, right? Another way that we collect information is internal defense in depth. So there's some things that we can't scan for, right? Because to use the house example again, we can't enter your house, it's your house. The other way that we collect information when we underwrite is a supplemental or application questions. And these things are do you enforce MFA on your VPN? We've had claims where, an adversary will log into the VPN and then attack the network because they're already in the house. What is your PII count? We can't scan for that. So I guess it's a two-pronged approach. One is the InsurTech side, which is where we get where we have our competitive edge. We're very good at scanning the attack surface. And then two is, the traditional insurance side, which is, how big is your company? Do you have MFA, this and that? I'll bring up an interesting point that goes a tiny bit off topic, but it's very interesting. So we do have threat intelligence partners that are in adversary chat rooms, the compromised adversary botnet panels, which these are basically the things that, when you're hacked, your computer calls back to this command and control server. So we do know, and we notify on this too, that the ransomware gangs are kind of like evil underwriters, right? So, the way insurance works is the biggest indicator of the price of your policy or whatever is your revenue. So that's the base number where we adjust how much your policy is going to be. So adversaries, and we know this because we're in the chat rooms and we've seen this behavior, they also base the ransom on your revenue. So we have had situations where we've had an insured that, we knew they were an insured. We have a list of all our insureds, and we saw their name pop up in one of these chat rooms, and it said, this company, 440K. And so we got on the phone with them, we deployed EDR, we mitigated that, and we stopped the ransomware from being deployed. But it's interesting that the ransomware gangs are kind of like evil underwriters. They're trying to see if we hack this company, how much can we get from the ransom? Whereas Coalition, it's kind of how much will the policy cost based on the controls in place? So both the ransom demand and the policy, the initial point of determining what it is based on revenue, which is, I think, super interesting.
Yeah, ultimately they're looking for how much they think the company's going to be able to pay out. So revenue is a good proxy for determining, is this $1 million ransomware or 10 million or 50 or whatever the number is. And you definitely, with some of the really high profile ones that have been in the news over the last couple of months, when you start seeing ransoms in the tens of millions, you know that those are companies that unfortunately have the pockets to be able to pay out something like that.
Yep, and it's this constant game of cat and mouse with these adversaries, right? We're getting threat intelligence where we compromise their systems to see who they're targeting. How can we mitigate that? Basically, we're trying to stomp out fires on our entire book before they become ransomware. So it's definitely we have to stay one step ahead of them. And I think in general, we have done that. We're doing very well. But it's definitely it's an interesting dichotomy.
So we got another question that came in about the role of middleware software and firewalls to segregate different components of an organization's network, so that something like email, for example, phishing that's targeting someone's email can't ultimately take down the rest of their network. And curious, Adam and Alex, how you two would respond to that, about sort of what defenses internally in a network an organization should put in place to ensure that it's sort of cordoned off from key key things like email or cloud storage and that kind of thing.
Well,
Yeah, I mean, I think.
Go on.
Yeah, no, you go for it.
Okay. Yeah, like Alex was mentioning before, network segmentation is a big part of this. If you want to try to reduce the amount of damage that can be done across an organization, you definitely want to identify, data that is of greater importance or more critical, put it in a separate network or at least behind some additional, layers of encryption. And hopefully, if they're not connected, especially that the malware won't be able to spread there through a phishing attack. But beyond that, a lot of what's the kind of good thing about phishing, I know that there isn't any good thing, right? but between a manual attack where someone like brute forces a port, breaks in, and then there's an actual like human sitting behind a keyboard and navigating through your network, and they can do all kinds of stuff like disabling security suite, software, or creating new accounts or whatever. The good thing about phishing is that a lot of this is just kind of generic malware that they launch. It's meant to get initial foothold, create a backdoor for an actor, collect information, things like that. And but it's not usually designed to kill software. It usually gets killed by software. So as long as you have endpoint protection tools and the ability to both isolate a system quickly or automatically, push updates, push scan requests, and keep your network secure by the endpoints, being able to do that and having that kind of view into your own network security is definitely going to make it a lot easier to stop a lot of these threats before they actually get out of hand. And that's really what you're doing when you're fighting against phishing kind of threats and automated malware threats. It's a race against time. And if you can stop them before they spread, then you've won.
Yeah, no, I think just to add on to that. So I think I'm going to try and extend Tommy's house analogy here. So I think if you think about putting a zero trust product in place, what you're really saying is I'm going to assume that every network connection request is malicious. So what do I do about that? So if we take our house analogy, we've now got the wall around the house, doesn't have any doors in it anymore. Great. What about inside the house? So I think it's sort of akin to like turning your house into an apartment building. So in a house, you can move around any room. There usually aren't locks on most doors. An apartment building, well, you can get in the building, but then which unit can you get into? If we take that even further, you can think about like a hotel. So I can't even get into a single room in the hotel without having a key card that says I'm allowed to get into that room. And that's how you really like what a zero trust type product tries to do is say, yes, network segmentation is important. Don't connect networks that shouldn't be connected. But then even within those networks, for an individual service, an individual destination, have very granular controls around like who's allowed to access what. So that's one thing. The other thing I was going to say is I think something we haven't talked about enough actually in this conversation is visibility. So one of the things that we also talked to our customers about is like this concept of like sort of like identity first networking. And so if you think about what most firewalls and other sort of like network security products have been doing for the last 20 years is they basically said, okay, give us all your network traffic and we'll look for the things that look suspicious. So what you're saying is you're saying people are allowed to send packets around the network and it's pretty easy to fake a lot of information about network packets, but we'll rely on some tool to look for that needle in the haystack. What we're again trying to like get people to shift their thinking on is you should really invert that. And you should say that no network traffic is allowed to travel in any network unless it's been explicitly authorized. And if you can attach an identity to every network request, then it actually becomes a lot easier to figure out what behavior looks anomalous. So going back to like Adam's example, if I've been infected with some malware and I'm doing a bunch of stuff that I would normally never do, or maybe not do in the same access pattern or volume of data, then it becomes like much easier to like focus on like trying to find those anomalies. So I do think like visibility is also like a really big part of this because as Adam, as you're saying, is like it allows you to figure out what the problem is and address it much more quickly.
As a follow-on to that, and Alex, I'd love for you to take this question. How should organizations think about network security and perimeter security differently in the remote working and sort of post-pandemic world? I mean, obviously the shape of how companies work and collaborate has changed dramatically over the last year and a half. And so just curious how that should impact how companies think about these problems of their, securing their perimeter and securing remote workers.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think as we've I think if there's any takeaway from the session, it's like forget about perimeters. They don't exist anymore. So I think it's like start there and just even if people go back to the office, I think we should be taking this thinking back to the office and say that just because you're in the office doesn't mean you have access to anything. So you should be thinking that no matter whether someone's in the office, they're at home, they're traveling, is you should really be uh, taking an approach where you're locking down that person's access to only what they need to access. So it's this concept of like least privilege access. So I think that's one thing. So that's sort of like this idea of you reduce the blast radius, you reduce what they have access to if they do get compromised. You don't think about a permanent anymore. You think about a one-to-one connection from that person to destination. And then I think the other thing you have to keep in mind is this idea of like context. So if I'm running, if I'm using my work provision laptop, which ideally has Malwarebytes running on it, and is provisioned centrally with an MDM, that should be a signal to say that okay, there's a much higher, we can equate that with a much higher level of trust in the device. Doesn't mean it's absolute trust, but that matters compared to I'm trying to access something from my cell phone and I'm on vacation in Europe. Right? Like those situations are completely different, and most products today don't take that into account. So I think part of if you think about all these different layers, what have we talked about? We've talked about eliminate the perimeter, right? So it doesn't exist anymore. Obfuscate it, so it's not visible. Segment things so that you get down to the lowest level of segmentation from person to destination. And then lastly, take into account what's happening every single time a connection request is made. And so I think to sort of like answer the question, I think like the remote work example is, I think more, I don't see it as a special situation. I think it's more of a wake up call that like we should be approaching the way that people gain access to work resources differently across the board, whether they're working remotely or they go back to the office, it's the same thing. And so I think really it's time to start thinking differently about it.
I completely agree. I wanted to point out that, during the pandemic and everyone working from home and stuff, it did seem like suddenly, oh, this was a new problem. People had to figure out how to be secure. But by solving that problem, by figuring out how to be secure for your remote people, you're securing your organization more across the board. I mean, think about how many people's organizations have executives that go on trips, or VPs that go to conferences that need to access your code base, and need to access some other internal resource, and they do it through an insecure VPN or something like that. By creating these policies to secure your remote people, you're also doing the same for anyone that might be on vacation or out at a conference or something like that. And it's just a whole lot better, honestly. So Alex, everything you said is dead on. I agree.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that I think Tommy maybe you brought up at the very beginning, but there is definitely an inherent trade-off between convenience and security. And so, of course, the least convenient thing would be you're not allowed to access anything, but it turns out that that's very secure because nothing's going to happen to it if no one can access it. But that's not realistic. And so I think what I think like we're very focused on, I think we're very cognizant of, is that if it's too inconvenient, the technical solution may be quite secure, but employees won't actually adopt it. And so I think that's where I think if you're thinking about switching over to more of like a zero trust architecture internally, is like I think really thinking about like what will the impact be on employees, and then how will you manage the change management process as you're going to roll out those changes, because you will have like a revolt on your hands if you make everyone's life really difficult. And we've definitely seen like whole categories of products fail because of that. And I think like the best example I can think of is MDM for people's cell phones, because of course everybody said, well, you're going to install what on my phone and you're going to be able to wipe everything whenever you feel like it. Like people just aren't okay with that. Right? So I think finding this like balance where you get more usability and more security, I think is like win-win for everybody.
Well, that was a great discussion, and I think probably a good place to wrap. Just some really interesting takeaways there around, as you said, it's not just about understanding at each individual device or at the network level. It's really sort of every endpoint, and really thinking about who needs to have access to what and at what time, and really sort of building that into your systems from the ground up. Well, I want to say, first off, thank you to the three of you for participating and for joining us in this discussion. It's been really sort of eye-opening about the role that these different solutions sort of come together in thinking about, again, sort of creating a layered security solution and really sort of end-to-end security from ransomware and from malware, among other threats. Just as a final thought here, we're joined by a broad set of folks across the insurance brokerage community and businesses who are interested in learning more about these solutions. If you're a broker and interested in learning more about partnering with Coalition, I would encourage you to go to signup.coalitioninc.com and you can learn about the appointment process there. And for policyholders or for organizations who are interested in learning more about these security tools that Coalition offers, as well as the partner solutions from Twingate and Malwarebytes, go to control.coalitioninc.com to sign up there for free. All right, thank you everyone for joining us, and thanks to Alex, Adam, and Tommy, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.